Hello, my name is Christina Wiegand and I am staff with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and this is an overview of Coastal Migratory Pelagics Amendment 32, which addresses Gulf of Mexico Migratory Group Cobia catch limits, possession limits, size limits, and the Coastal Migratory Pelagics Framework Procedure. During this overview, we're going to cover the background of Gulf Cobia management. We're going to talk about why the councils are considering action. We'll go over the actions and alternatives that are included in this amendment, the amendment timeline, as well as upcoming options to provide your public comment. So first things first, where are we in the amendment development process? So based on the updated stock assessment and feedback that the councils have received from stakeholders, they developed some proposed actions and alternatives that are aimed at addressing overfishing of Gulf cobia, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. The council has reviewed analyses on the biological, economic, and social effects of the proposed actions and alternatives, and now they're holding public hearings in order to collect a little more feedback from stakeholders on the current alternatives or suggestions for additional alternatives. And of course, in addition to these public hearings that we'll be holding, a comment session is always held during the week of the council meeting to address any amendments under development. First, I want to go over a little bit of background on how Gulf Group Cobia is managed. It's managed through the Coastal Migratory Pelagics Fishery Management Plan, which is a joint plan between the Gulf Council and the South Atlantic Council. Gulf Group Cobia refers to cobia that are south of the Florida-Georgia line all the way through the Gulf of Mexico. And that area is broken up into two different zones. We have the Florida East Coast Zone, which is the responsibility of the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and then the Gulf Zone. And the boundary between those two zones is the council boundary right outside of the Florida Keys. Now, Atlantic Group Cobia used to be managed by the councils, but as of March 2019, they are no longer part of the Federal Fishery Management Plan and are now managed exclusively by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Here you can see the current management measures for Gulf Group Cobia. The fishing season is year-round, beginning January 1st and running through December 31st. The daily possession limit for the commercial and recreational sectors is 2 fish per person. Now, the minimum size limit varies based on which zone you're fishing in. If you're fishing in the Gulf zone, the minimum size is 36 inches fork length, and if you're fishing in the Florida East Coast zone or the FLEC zone, the minimum size limit is 33 inches fork length. Now, because Gulf Group Cobia is broken up into these two different zones, there is an apportionment or percentage of the annual catch limit that goes to each zone. Currently, the Gulf Zone is apportioned 64% of the Gulf Group ABC ACL, and the FLEC Zone is apportioned 36%. Now, in the Gulf Zone, it's the stock ACL, there are no sector allocations, whereas in the FLEC Zone, there are sector allocations, which are currently 8% commercial and 92% recreational. There's also a buffer between the ACL and annual catch target. And for the Gulf Zone, that's a 10% buffer, and for the FLEC Zone, it's a 17% buffer. Now, in terms of accountability measures, the Gulf Zones are very simple because they don't have sector allocations. It's simply when the annual catch target is reached, the fishery will be closed. For the FLEC Zone, accountability measures are broken up based on sector. So for the commercial sector, when their ACL is reached, the sale of cobia is prohibited. And for the recreational sector, if the total, so the stock ACL, is exceeded, the following year's season is reduced in order to achieve that recreational ACT. And then overall, if cobia is overfished and the total annual catch limit is exceeded, there will be a payback the following fishing year. So why are the councils considering action on Gulf Group Cobia? Well, the updated CDR 28 stock assessment for Gulf Group Cobia was completed back in July 2020. And that stock assessment included updated recreational catch and effort data that are derived using the new MRIP Fishing Effort Survey, which formally replaced the MRIP Coastal Household Telephone Survey back in 2018. This change resulted in an increased estimates of virgin spawning stock biomass, recruitment, and projected yields. The results from the stock assessment did indicate that Gulf Group Cobia is undergoing overfishing with biomass at reduced levels, which puts the stock at risk of becoming overfished if no change in management is explored. Moreover, the assessment suggests that the stock has actually been experiencing overfishing every year from 1975 through 2018, with the exceptions of 2009 and 1983. And so, since the stock is currently undergoing overfishing, the Council has to take management action to end overfishing and prevent the stock from becoming overfished. Upon reviewing the updated stock assessment, the Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee, or SSC, determined that the results were best scientific information available, and they recommended an increasing yield stream for overfishing limits and acceptable biological catch limits for 2021 to 2023 and beyond. And you can see those estimates in the table on your screen. And it is worth noting that the increase in the stock catch limits is solely a result of converting the recreational catch and effort data to the new MRIP FES data currency. Had MRIP FES recreational data been available for the previous stock assessment held in 2013, the current annual catch limit recommendations would represent approximately a 33% decrease in yield from the previous stock assessment. And so based on that information, the Council has moved forward with developing Amendment 32 to the CMP-FMP. And the purpose of this plan amendment is to consider whether to modify Gulf Group Cobia catch limits, revise the apportionment between the Gulf Zone and the Flex Zone for Gulf Group Cobia in response to new information on the stock provided in the CDAR 28 Update Stock Assessment, revise the sector allocations in the Flex Zone, modify management measures related to size and possession limits, and to clarify language in the CMP framework procedure regarding the responsibilities of the Gulf and South Atlantic Councils for management of Gulf Group Cobia. The need for this amendment is to end overfishing of Gulf Group Cobia as required by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, update existing Gulf Group Cobia catch limits to be consistent with best scientific information available and contemporary data collection methods, and to clarify the Gulf and South Atlantic Council's responsibilities in the CMP framework procedure. Now we'll move into the specific management actions and alternatives that are proposed within this amendment. Action 1 looks at modifying Gulf Group Cobia stock overfishing limits, acceptable biological catch, and annual catch limits. The councils have to consider adjusting the Gulf Cobia OFLs and ABCs in order to be consistent with SSC recommendations discussed previously. And since the current MRIP FES equivalent total ACL of 4.5 million pounds exceeds all newly recommended ABCs, the council must also adjust the Cobia total ACL. Now this ACL is for the entire Gulf Group Cobia area. So from that Florida-Georgia line all the way through the Gulf of Mexico. In the next few actions, we'll be addressing the apportionment as well as sector allocations for the Flex Zone. But this ACL that we're talking about here would be applicable to the entire management area. And here you can see all of the alternatives under Action 1. Alternative 1, or the no action alternative, would retain the existing OFL, ABC, and ACL, all of which are based on the previous stock assessment from 2013, which utilized MRIP CHTA data. Therefore, retaining the past OFL, ABC, and ACL under Alternative 1 is not really a viable alternative because it's no longer based on the best scientific information available. Preferred Alternative 2 would modify the catch limits for Gulf Group Cobia based on the recommendations from the SSC. And it sets the stock ACL equal to the SSC's recommendation for the stock ABC for 2021 through 2023, and then maintains the ABC and ACL at the 2023 level for subsequent years until changed by future management action. And Alternative 3 would modify the catch limits for Gulf Group Cobia as a constant catch based on the SSC's recommended OFL and ABC for 2021. Here in this table, you can see the specific OFL, ABC, and ACL levels for each of the preferred alternatives. When comparing historical Gulf Group Cobia landings that are adjusted in FES currency to the 2001 OFL, ABC, and ACL in Preferred Alternative 2, the lowest of the 2021-2023 SSC recommended catch limits, total Gulf Group Cobia landings would have exceeded the ACL in 6 of the 8 years since ACLs were implemented. And as a result, changes to other management measures may be needed in order to constrain harvest to the ACL and prevent an overage of the overfishing level. And in the next few actions, we'll also be discussing modifications to management measures. Action 2 looks at modifying the Gulf Group Cobia stock apportionment between the Gulf Zone and the Florida East Coast or Flex Zone. The current apportionment was set in Amendment 20B and allocated 64% of the ACL to the Gulf Zone and 36% to the Flex Zone based on the combined average landings of Gulf Group Cobia from 1998 to 2012 across its range. So Texas east and north to the Florida-Georgia state boundary. And this time period was selected as it included landings from the most recent 15 years, which at the time was the longest period that could capture the long-term dynamics of the stock. However, the new MRIP FES landings indicate that a slightly greater proportion of landings can historically be attributed to the Gulf Zone. And so the councils must consider adjusting the apportionment between zones to be consistent with the best scientific information available. And the zone ACLs that are going to be presented in this action are going to be based on the ACL that was selected in the previous action, Action 1. And here are the alternatives contained under Action 2. Under Alternative 1 of this action, zone apportionments would not be modified according to the MRIP FES data currency, and so as a result, it's not a viable alternative because it's not based on the best scientific information available. Alternative 2 would transition recreational data monitoring from MRIP CHTS to MRIP FES, but the percentages used from the ACL apportionment would remain the same, and catch limits would be updated using this apportionment. Under Preferred Alternative 3, again, recreational data monitoring would be transitioned from CHTS to MRIP FES, but it retains the time period used in Amendment 20B to calculate the apportionment, and catch limits would be updated using this apportionment. Under Alternative 4, again, it will update the recreational data and would consider more recent time periods, namely 2003 to 2019. However, it's important to note that the time series may be biased by recent changes in management to Gulf Zone Cobia. And here in this table, you can see the resulting zone ACLs that would result from each of the possible apportionment alternatives proposed in Action 2. Action 3 looks at modifying the Florida East Coast Zone Cobia allocation between the commercial and recreational sectors. And again, these sector allocations are just for the Florida East Coast Zone. The Gulf Zone does not utilize sector allocations. So in Amendment 18, the South Atlantic Council and the Gulf Council established ABCs, ACLs, and sector allocations for separate migratory groups of cobia using the Gulf and South Atlantic Council's jurisdiction, which is just west of the dry tortugas. The South Atlantic Council chose an allocation formula for Atlantic Group Cobia that balanced historical catches, so from about 2000 to 2008, with more recent landings, or 2006 to 2008. And the South Atlantic Council chose to maintain the current sector allocation percentages when the management boundary was revised to that Florida-Georgia line. Now, again, similar to the last action, because MRIP FES landings were incorporated into the new stock assessment, they indicate an increase in the proportion of recreational landings, and the council must consider adjusting the allocations in the flex zone to be consistent with the best scientific information available. And again, these sector ACLs will be based on the ACL that was selected in Alternative 1 for the entire Gulf Group Cobia management area, the apportionment selected in Action 2 for the Gulf Zone and the Flex Zone. Here you can see the alternatives under Action 3. The sector allocations under Alternative 1 were based on historic Atlantic Cobia group landings for the entire Mid-Atlantic and South Atlantic region using MRIP CHTS, and therefore are no longer best scientific information available, making Alternative 1 not a viable alternative. Alternative 2 would use the same formula and time series used for Alternative 1. However, landings data for Flex Zone Cobia using MRIP FES adjusted recreational data would be used. Preferred Alternative 3 would retain an allocation of 8% to the commercial sector and 92% to the recreational sector, with the resulting catch limits determined using the MRIP FES data. Alternative 4 would hold the commercial sector at their current catch limit of 70,000 pounds during the 2021 fishing season, determine the allocation percentage by this fixed commercial catch limit, and allocate the remaining revised Flex Zone ACL to the recreational sector. The commercial and recreational catch limits would then be updated based on the allocation percentages in place for the 2021 season for 2022, 2023, and beyond. Here you can see the resulting commercial and recreational ACLs based on the different allocation alternatives. And based on the possible ACLs, a commercial closure analysis and a projection of when the recreational ACL would be met was conducted for the Flex Zone. The recreational ACLs are predicted to be met during the month of August under the ACLs projected for 2022. However, recreational Flex Zone Cobia currently do not have an in-season accountability measure. Their post-season accountability measure states that if the total Flex Zone or the stock ACL is exceeded in 1 year, then in the following year the recreational season will be projected to and closed when the annual catch target is met. And based on the analysis of the most conservative Flex Zone commercial sector ACLs, no closures are projected. Next up, we have Action 4, which looks at updating and/or establishing annual catch targets for the Gulf Group Cobia zones, so Gulf Zone and Flex Zone. Currently, the Gulf Zone ACT equals 90% of the Gulf Zone ACL, and the Flex Zone recreational ACT equals 83% of the Flex Zone ACL, based on the equation you can see on your screen. For the time series in Action 2, Preferred Alternative 3, the average PSE for the recreational data was 0.24. So under Alternative 1, the resulting Flex Zone ACT would be equal to the Flex Zone ACT multiplied by 1 minus 0.24 or 0.76, setting the Flex Zone ACT at 76% of the Flex Zone ACL. Alternatives 2 and 3 would update the calculation for determining the ACT by using the Gulf Council's ACL-ACT control rule. And under this control rule, the ACT for the Gulf Zone and for the recreational sector in the Flex Zone would be set to 10% below their respective zones. Alternative 3 provides an option to establish an ACT for the commercial sector in the Flex Zone, which would also be set to 10% below the commercial ACL. However, at this time, because there is no established annual catch target for the commercial sector, it's not a part of the accountability measures and thus would have no management consequence. And while Alternative 1 results in a larger buffer for the Flex Zone, selecting Alternative 2 standardizes the ACT calculations for Gulf Group Cobia in the Flex Zone, similar to how they are calculated for other Gulf federally managed species to create consistency. Next, we have Action 5, which looks at modifying the possession, vessel, and trip limits in the Gulf Zone and the Flex Zone. And this has been divided into 2 sub-actions to provide the councils the opportunity to select changes in the possession, vessel, and trip limits by different zones. And so currently the daily possession limit in the Gulf Zone is 2 fish per person, regardless of the number or duration of trips, and there is no commercial or recreational trip or vessel limit. Similarly, in the Flex Zone, the recreational and commercial daily possession limits are 2 fish per person, with no recreational or commercial trip or vessel limit. And so the councils are considering options to reduce harvest mortality and constrain Gulf Group Cobia harvest to the reduced ACL. And they're doing this by reducing the number of legal-sized cobia retained per trip. However, analyses show that the reductions ultimately have minimal effects because landings are already low and most trips land one or less cobia. Here are the alternatives under Action 5.1, which looks at modifications for the Gulf Zone. Alternative 1 would maintain the current daily possession limit for Gulf Zone cobia of 2 fish per person for both sectors without a vessel or trip limit. Preferred Alternative 2 would decrease the per person daily possession limit for Gulf Zone cobia from 2 to 1 fish per day regardless of the number or duration of trips taken, resulting in halving the maximum possible harvest per person. Preferred Alternative 3 would create a recreational vessel limit for Gulf Zone cobia. Anglers would not be permitted to exceed the per person daily possession limit. And finally, Preferred Alternative 4 would create a commercial trip limit for Gulf Zone cobia, and commercial fishermen would not be permitted to exceed the per person daily possession limit. In this table, you can see the possible reductions in Gulf Zone cobia landings based on the previous action and alternatives. Under Alternative 2, because less than 1 cobia per angler is already retained on average on all trips in the Gulf Zone, reducing the per person possession limit to 1 fish per day is projected to result in a minimal reduction to harvest rate. Similarly, under Alternative 3, the predicted reductions in harvest are low, and again, under Alternative 4, majority of commercial trips average 1 or fewer cobia, and so the predicted reductions are again low. Here is Action 5.2. This looks at modifying the possession, vessel, and trip limits for the flex zone. The alternatives under this action match those under Action 5.1, and currently the Gulf and South Atlantic Councils agree on preferreds and have selected identical preferreds between Action 5.1 and 5.2, which would result in consistency in possession, vessel, and trip limits between the Gulf Zone and the flex zone. And here again is a table that shows the estimated reduction in flex zone landings. And, like in the Gulf Zone, fewer than 2 cobia per angler are already retained on average on trips in the flex zone, so reducing the per person possession limit to 1 fish per day as proposed in Alternative 2 is expected to result in only minimal reductions in harvest levels. Under Alternative 3, while the majority of recreational trips catching cobia average 1 fish retained per vessel, there is a small predicted reduction in harvest for preferred option 3A. And under Alternative 4, similarly to the recreational sector, the majority of commercial trips are averaging 1 cobia per trip. However, predicted reductions in commercial harvest for option 4A are smaller than what they are for the recreational sector. Next up, we have Action 6, which looks at modifying the Gulf Group Cobia minimum size limit. The current minimum size limit in the Gulf Zone is 36 inches fork length and 33 inches fork length for the flex zone. In general, increasing the minimum size limit is expected to reduce fishing harvest in 2 ways. First, anglers would be expected to release cobia that they would otherwise retain under the current regulations, and that would increase the probability of fish reproducing perhaps more than once before being selected by the fishery. And here you can see the proposed alternatives under Action 6. Alternative 1 would not change the minimum size limit of 36 inches fork length for the Gulf Zone or 33 inches fork length for the flex zone. Preferred Alternative 2 would increase the minimum size limit for the flex zone from 33 inches to 36 inches fork length to be equal to the minimum size limit in the Gulf Zone and is expected to reduce flex zone landings for both sectors. Increasing the minimum size limit under Alternative 3 to 39 inches fork length and 4, 42 inches fork length would indirectly drive fishing efforts to target more fecund female cobia, which may ultimately have negative effects on the spawning stock biomass. And here on this table, you can see the estimated % reduction in commercial landings for the Gulf and Flex Zone for the proposed alternatives under Action 6. And similarly on this side, you can see the estimated % reduction in recreational landings for the Gulf and Flex Zones for the proposed alternatives under Action 6. And last but not least, we have Action 7, which looks at modifying the Coastal Migratory Pelagics Framework Procedure. And this framework procedure allows the councils to change specific management measures through framework amendments. And typically these changes can be implemented within a shorter time frame than a full plan amendment. Alternative 1 allows the South Atlantic Council to modify specific management measures for Gulf Group Cobia in the Flex Zone. And those management measures are vessel trip limits, close seasons or areas, or gear restrictions. Alternative 2 would expand the South Atlantic Council's responsibilities beyond setting vessel trip limits, closed seasons or areas, and gear restrictions without a vote from the Gulf Council, which would allow the South Atlantic Council to independently approve framework amendments specifically pertaining to management of Flex Zone Cobia. Explicitly defining additional management measures that the South Atlantic Council may recommend independently will allow the South Atlantic Council to react more quickly to new information. However, preferred alternative 2 would not allow the South Atlantic Council to make unilateral changes to management measures that affect the entire Gulf Migratory Group Cobia throughout its range, such as removing the Flex Zone apportionment, modifying OFL or ABC, or the entire Gulf Group Cobia ACL. That summarizes all of the actions in this amendment. As I said earlier, currently we're at the public hearing stage. The Gulf Council is going to review public hearing comments, make modifications, and consider this amendment for formal review at their October meeting. The South Atlantic Council will do the same thing at our December meeting. And if both councils approve the amendment for formal review, the amendment will be transmitted to NIMS for secretarial review sometime in the winter of 2022. There are several different opportunities for you to provide your public comment. We will be holding in-person public hearings throughout the state of Florida. Those public hearings will begin with a staff presentation, an opportunity to ask questions, followed by an opportunity to provide formal public comment on the record for council members to hear. All of these public hearings will begin at 6 p.m. Eastern. On October 18th, we'll be in Key West, Florida, October 19th, Jupiter, October 20th in Cocoa Beach, and October 21st in Jacksonville. If you're unable to make an in-person public hearing, you also have an opportunity to submit written comments. You can do that through our online public comment form. You can also send comments by mail or by fax. Finally, note that the deadline for written comments to be included in the comment overview that will be presented to the Gulf Council at their October 2021 meeting is October 21st at 5 p.m. And you're able to find this presentation along with other summary documents on our website at the link below. Thank you for listening to this presentation. If you have any additional questions about this amendment or the Coastal Migratory Pelagics FMP, please feel free to reach out to me at the email provided. If you have additional questions about the South Atlantic Council, you're welcome to reach out to Cameron Rhodes, our Outreach Program Manager. And we're also available on our website and social media at the links provided.